than me.
Shall we?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We'll just be waiting a couple of minutes to let people join and get settled in. If you get a notification to be promoted into panelists, please accept that notification so that you're able to turn on your cameras and participate during Q&A and use the chat function throughout the webinar. Thank you.
So good morning and good afternoon, everybody. We're going to start in a few minutes. And as Daphne was saying, please try to open your cameras, and it'll be nice to kind of create a bit of a community feel to this conversation.
While we're waiting, Charles, do you want to talk about the Summer Institute?
No, okay.
No.
Well, you go ahead, Daphne.
Okay. So we're about to begin recruitment for the ISGAP Oxford Summer Institute for Curriculum Development in Critical Contemporary Antisemitism Studies. This is our annual program at Oxford University. If you are a young scholar, a professor, PhD student, you can contact me and get more information. I'll be putting the website in the chat. We do a very intense, very fun anti-Semitism training program, and it's the best time. So I recommend that you apply. If you know anybody that would like to apply, please refer them to me. I'll put my email information in the chat as well.
Definitely. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Please turn on your cameras. I think Daphne has invited you to be a panelist, and I think if you click on that symbol, your camera will come on and you'll be able to join us.
Okay.
So wait till 1 more minute, 5 after the hour, and we'll start. Please turn on your cameras.
Wait, what's the matter, Bobby?
Hello, Emmanuel. Nice to see you again. So please turn on your cameras and we're going to begin. So, as many of you know, I see familiar faces. My name is Charles Small. I'm the director of ISGAP. And it's an honor for me to be here with 2 of my esteemed colleagues. We'll have the three speakers today, including myself. The other speaker, the person who will start, is Professor David Patterson. David is a professor at the University of Dallas of Texas at Dallas. Yeah. Former head of the Ackerman Center on Holocaust Studies, and David is a senior research fellow with ISGAP and one of our leading colleagues and scholars at ISGAP, an expert in the Holocaust, radical Islam, and contemporary anti-Semitism. And also we have Bill Kolbrener. Bill is the director of academic development for ISGAP, and he's a professor of English literature at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. So we're honored that 2 of my great colleagues are with me. So David, the floor is yours if you'll start off, and then I'll go after you, and then Bill will have the last word, and we can open it up for a conversation and Q&A.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Daphne and Bill. Yes, we're speaking today in connection with International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is tomorrow. And on the topic of the racialization of the Jews then and now. Now, what does racialization of the Jews mean exactly? What does it have to do with Holocaust? What does it have to do with remembrance? 1,000 years ago, about 1,000 years ago, a Muslim conqueror named Ibn Tumart was out to purify North Africa, Muslim lands. Ibn Tumart died in 1130, and he said, "Come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance." The Nazis waged a similar war against memory. Both Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi described the Holocaust independently of each other as a war against memory. If you saw Schindler's List, you may recall the scene when Amon Gert is giving a pep talk to his troops just as they go in to liquidate the Krakow ghetto. And he says, Jews have been in Krakow for 800 years. By the end of the afternoon, those 800 years will be a rumor. Connected to this war on memory is a war on the name, on the identity. Racializing the Jews undermines their right or their ability, their capacity to define their own identity and determine their own destiny, their own name. In 1938, for example, the Nazis declared that all male Jews in Germany would be named Israel and all female Jews would be named Sarah. And I myself have seen mail envelopes with return addresses with Israel and Sarah in quotes. We do have a racializing of the Jews taking place in our own time. Racializing the Jews, again, undermines the Jewish capacity, ability, possibility for self-definition. The Jews are not a race. I'm teaching a course on anti-Semitism now, and I showed my students a picture of a gallery of Jews, all colors, all cultures, and I asked them, what race are these people? They're not a race. So the racialization of the Jews and of other groups is a step that leads toward extermination in the end, because racializing is essentializing, which, in other words, this is how they are inherently. And ultimately, with the Jews, it's demonizing. It's attaching to the Jew an essence that is inalterable and invariably threatening. So that in racializing the Jews, you determine not that all Jews are evil, but that all evil is Jewish. Racializing the Jews, even the move to racialize the Jews or anyone else, is an erasure of the millennial teaching and testimony that comes from the Jewish people, and it's a testimony that undermines the very category of race. The rabbis ask, why does God begin with one, with Adam, and not with two? And it's so that no one can say to another, my side of the family is better than your side. We're all B'nai Adam, right? Children of Adam. And with that, there are many movements, ideologies, social movements, academic movements, such as critical race theory, that adopt race as a defining category of a human being. And it's a category that is minimally anti-Judaic. Ibram X. Kendi is a well-known author of a book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he says in that book, the most threatening racist movement is not the alt-right's drive for a white ethno-state. That's not the most threatening. The most threatening racist movement is America's drive, the average American's drive for a race-neutral country. In other words, the real racist denies that the essentialism of race as a first principle. And this makes the Jew the real racist. It makes the Jew white. It makes the Jew a power broker, a manipulator, an oppressor who enjoys all the privilege that comes with being white. So white is not about color. In this case, racializing is a metaphysical move, I would say. It's to render the Jews as themselves racist. The Jew, I mean, everyone knows the Jewish state is racist. Zionism is racism, right? It's to render the Jews as racist precisely for rejecting race as an essentializing category. Let me just kind of make a connection with the Holocaust here. I think the racialization of the Jews is about eliminating Jewish identity as Jews and not as vermin or contagion or, satanic. It's about the obliteration of a remembrance and a name, of a Yad Vashem. I think there's a reason why the Holocaust Research and Memorial Center in Jerusalem is called Yad Vashem, a remembrance and a name. From the prophet Isaiah, where it's written, "And to them will I give in my house and within my walls a remembrance and a name. An everlasting name shall I give them, a Yad Vashem." Memory is what makes the name everlasting. Therefore, memory is tied not only to time, but also to eternity, to what remains eternally dear, eternally precious, what eternally summons us to say, "Here I am for you," to the other human being, who is a Ben Adam, a child of Adam. And I think this testimony that goes forth from Zion, in the end, is what the anti-Zionist is anti. Because it undermines a racializing project, and anti-Zionism almost invariably buys into this move to racialize people. So those are my opening thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much, David. It's appreciated as always. So I'll make some remarks now, and then when I'm done, Bill will also provide some remarks, and we'll open it up for Q&A. So here we are on another Holocaust Memorial Day, which is tomorrow. And I'm reminded of the words of Elie Wiesel in 2003 at the Canadian Parliament at a conference on contemporary anti-Semitism. Elie Wiesel, who was the first honorary president of ISGAP, by the way, said that we are living in a time of great urgency, and that he was never so concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in 2003 as he was since the Holocaust, since the end of World War II in 1945. And then Elie Wiesel went on to correct himself, and he said, "No, we're not living in a time of great urgency. We are living in a time of a great emergency." And this was 2003, and we all know, all of us on this call, on this Zoom conference, knows that from 2003 to 2023, in the last 20 years, anti-Semitism is exploding throughout the world and in places that some of us thought would never happen. I remember vividly that my colleagues at ISGAP were doing studies showing that the rise of anti-Semitism that was sweeping into Europe, into Western Europe, and was sweeping into Canada was on its way to the United States. And so many people, especially in the American Jewish community, said, no, somehow the United States is different, and the anti-Semitism of Europe, of Canada, of South America, of the Middle East cannot happen here. But we know, sadly, that anti-Semitism has arrived on the shores of the United States of America. It permeates our best institutions of higher education, and it even permeates the halls of governance at the highest levels. So why is this happening? And the title of the talk is The Racialization of the Jew. So very quickly, there's three types of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitisms. There's the religious form of anti-Semitism, the racist nationalist form of anti-Semitism, and the attack on who Jews are as a people. And in the words of Robert Wistrich, what makes anti-Semitism unique and so lethal is that it's inherently genocidal. So when the dominant perspective of perceiving reality was through the lens of religion, namely Christianity, the Jews were the quintessential other. The Jew was blinded by evil, by the devil, for not being able to accept the new covenant or recognizing the Christian notion of the Messiah as a Messiah. So the Jew was blinded. And what made anti-Semitism inherently genocidal is that the Christians, it wasn't enough for the Christians to say that the individual Jew was blinded, but that the fact that the Jews exist and don't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah, they were hindering redemption. They were basically hindering heaven on earth, and it was the fault of the Jew. But there were outs. Jews were forcibly converted and were able to convert to be somewhat accepted. When the lens shifted from religion to notions of ethnicity and race and biologically determined notions of identity, the Jew was perceived as an outsider, as poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race, and had to be eliminated. And racist forms of anti-Semitism culminates in the Shoah. And today, I think the dominant form of anti-Semitism, as we know, is the delegitimization of Israel, the demonization of Israel, and the attack on who Jews are as a people, our connection to our land, our connection to our culture, our connection to our peoplehood. So these are the three anti-Semitisms. Today, so we know that racist anti-Semitism, and the talk of this lecture is racialization then and now. The Jews were deemed not to be non-white, to threatening the purity of the white Aryan race. And in order to protect the purity of the white Aryan race, the Jew had to be eliminated. The inferior Semitic people had to be eliminated. Today, in the United States of America, in the most important universities in the country, Jews are perceived as white. But Jews are perceived as white as not sorry for what happened, sorry for the extermination of more than 6 million Jews and the destruction of European Jewish civilization, sorry for what happened and welcome to the club and we're sorry. No. What's happening today in a very short period of time, in less than 2 generations, the Jews were hunted and exterminated for not being white. Exterminated for not being white. And today, progressive intellectuals are portraying the Jew as white and the quintessential white, racist, apartheid supporting colonial fascist. Amazing. In less than 2 generations, the great intellectuals defined us in the universities. In Germany, the so-called scientists, the theologians, Karl Marx, they defined us as filthy and not white, not pure. And today, the great intellectuals are defining us as white and apartheid supporters. Incredible. And I'll just say, Emmanuel Levinas, just end on one note, Emmanuel Levinas, who was a scholar of urban sociology, who I studied in my days as a PhD student, he said that the minimal exercise of power is the capacity to define your identity. If a group of people cannot define themselves in society, they lack all power. It's the most basic element of power, to define ourselves. And ladies and gentlemen, especially in the United States, in the sort of racial formations of the United States and the divisions, it seems that the Jewish community is incapable of defining itself. And this is due to a disconnection from our wisdom, from our culture, from our knowledge. And it's also by being disconnected from who we are and understanding the beautiful concepts and the treasure of wisdom that we've inherited through the Torah and the teaching and the Talmud and the discourse that has gone on for thousands of years. When you're disconnected from that and you don't know who you are, when a group of people start to defining our community in certain ways, we're very susceptible to those definitions. And I think the internalization of white racialized identity in the American community by Jewish people, by young Jewish people in particular, in my view and the view of some sociologists, is an indication of a great level of disconnection and assimilation. So we need to understand who we are, we need to celebrate who we are, and to take pride in who we are, and to fight this onslaught of contemporary anti-Semitism as we commemorate the horrors of the Shoah that happened in historical terms, really just a moment ago. We still have survivors with us who went through it, who still remember and still have the experiences deep within them. So on that note, I'll leave it there, and I'll turn over to Bill Kolbrener, our colleague, our Director of Academic Development at ISGAP.
Hey, people. So first, I would just say that I'm really very much inspired by what Charles and David have both said. And I'm glad that we're using this occasion as not only an academic gathering, but as a kind of moment of reflection. And to think about these issues, our relationship to our present and our relationship to the past, and the Holocaust, which is of course so different for all of us. I'm going to actually say a few words and then ask David and Charles some questions, because I think maybe through that conversation we can clarify, because they both spoke, and I found a very complex and sometimes terms that could be expanded. So I'm going to ask some questions in a second. But I think just building upon what David and Charles said, and this idea of being able to create one's own identity, and the problem with Charles just identified as assimilating Jews to a kind of white universalism. I agree with Charles that the traditions that we share, and I think as Jews from whatever denomination, the Bible, the Talmud, the culture that we share, I think also with other monotheists, I think we have this in common. So I think the shared aspect of what we're doing entails not only going back to text, but Holocaust education, because the Holocaust is the unacknowledged trauma that informs everything. When I think of my generation of friends, Judaism was something my parents never spoke about the Holocaust. My mother's grandparents were in the Ukraine and would send letters every week. And one day they stopped getting the letters. We saw in the 70s, I remember I went to a film with my mom, and the opening sequence was the Holocaust. We had to walk out. This is not even the first generation American. This is second generation America. So our generation, my generation, we were just riding the wave of American success. And it was just, to be a young Jewish white male at that time was the best thing on earth, right? So many opportunities. And now everything has kind of changed. In any event, there is this repression of what happened, this inability to acknowledge the extent. It's like people who say that COVID is over, and I'm not talking about infections now. I'm talking about the psychic effects upon all of us. And the Holocaust, it's almost translated, it is, I think, it's transferred generationally. And I'm not talking about genetics. It's just we're all dealing with the trauma and the trauma of our parents. So I think what's also very, very important is Holocaust education. With that, I wanted to turn to David. I mean, you raised so many interesting questions. And this is kind of a dialogue that could go on again between you and Charles about exactly whether Jews are a race or not. I mean, when you were saying Jews are not a race emphatically to emphasize our diversity, you were not intending what Whoopi Goldberg said on The Voice, Jews are not a race. I mean, it's just so strange the way the rhetoric changes and can be used from so many different kinds of perspectives. I just wanted to explore, what is Whoopi Goldberg doing? What does that represent for her? And how does it fit in with these other models when she says Jews are not a race, not in the way that you did as a way of praising our diversity, but in a way of taking away the specificity of our experience, which is what you and Charles were both talking about, right? David, you're muted. Yeah, unmute. Yeah, we're yeah.
For Whoopi Goldberg, race defines identity. As soon as you take away race, then you take away essence, so to say. In other words, the victims of people who are victims of racists are victims. And the Jews cannot be turned over to the category of victim because the Jews are white, which makes the Jews the oppressor, not the victim. And if you say, well, the Nazis victimized them, I think I don't know what Whoopi Goldberg would say to that. Of course, she had to walk it back a little bit later. But the category of race itself, when it becomes something that defines the essence of a human being, is inherently anti-Judaic and just a half step from anti-Semitic.
Right. You used the term metaphysical actually to describe that, meaning we're assigning a kind of metaphysical reality or being.
Yes.
Can you maybe talk a little more about that?
Yes, it's a first principle. It's a premise from which one proceeds. The Nazis were not anti-Semites because they were racist. They were racist because they were anti-Semites. In other words, you have to establish an anti-Semitic, anti-Judaic premise concerning what imparts value to a human being in order to arrive at an anti-Semitic outlook. For the Nazi, race is a defining category for determining value, right? The Aryan has more value than the non-Aryan. For the Jew, it's not race, it's child of Adam, child of God. For the Jew, each of us has a fundamental connection to the other, which is articulated most fundamentally in an ethical responsibility. Where is your brother and what have you done? And it's God who asks. If race,
I mean, that's just very beautiful. The emphasis on the ethical responsibility, and also what you were saying earlier. I just wanted to emphasize this idea of Yad Vashem and the importance of the name, the importance of the name is what we are actually all doing here as part of ISGAP. Is we are giving, and Charles, this is describes our lecture series, comprehensive definition of what anti-Semitism is. We are giving anti-Semitism a name. And that in a way is fulfilling part of the mission that both of you spoke about in relationship to claiming our own identity. So Charles, I just wondered if you had anything to say about what this issue about race and are Jews a race, not a race?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So, I don't think we should focus to this exploring or discovering identity through the study of anti-Semitism. I think it's essential that Jewish people learn the wisdom of our culture and of our people and of our ancestors, and to celebrate it. There are concepts of justice, of freedom, of recognition of the other, of the godliness in all humanity, that is so powerful. That what we have brought to the world is incredible, and it's something that we should cherish and learn. And I think if we have pride in that learning, it will give us an important element within ourselves to combat the lies and the hatred about Jews and also about other people. And I think if we talk about race, race is a European invention. It's an invention. It's a social construction. It doesn't exist at an ethical level, as David rightfully points out. In Judaism, it's about humility. It's not toleration, and this sort of condescending notion of recognizing the other. In Judaism, we learn that to be a human being, as Emmanuel Levinas from the Talmud so eloquently taught, is that We need to recognize the other, to see our face in the face of the other, to be human. So as a Jew, I need the other to be human. I need the other to be an ethical Jewish person. Whereas in kind of liberal European thought, it's about tolerating the other. Very different. And race as a social construction comes out of European pseudoscience, eugenics, theology, military policy, the social sciences. It's a social construction. It doesn't exist in terms of our DNA composition. Phenotypical features is 0.0002301% of our DNA is phenotypical features, the color of our skin, the kind of hair, the shape of our nose. It's a minute part of our biological composition. So it's a social construction. And if you think about the American racialization, which is, I think, a fundamental element, it's the foundation of American society. America was built on white European supremacy. The indigenous people were eliminated. Africans were brought as slaves. There was slavery, there was Jim Crow. Go to any American city today and look around, and you can see the legacy of subjugation and segregation. It's still with us. And these racialized identities are very powerful. So Whoopi Goldberg is trying to understand the Holocaust as Jews are being labeled as white in America. So there's a disconnection. But if you take a step back, let me just finish my point. I just want to finish my point, please. I'm about to finish. Give me 40 more seconds. If you take a step back from the American context and think, the greatest victims of racialized mass murder as we commemorate the Shoah were Ashkenazi Jews. They were the vast majority of people that were subjugated and exterminated by the Nazis. And then here, the mavens at our best universities are trying to say that, well, the Jews are white. And then the progressive ones are saying, well, Jews are multicultural. There's Ethiopian Jews, there's African Jews, there's Yemenite Jews, there's brown Jews, and there's white Jews. But it's the white Jews that were the victims of the greatest crime of humanity, perhaps ever. Amazing. So that's my point.
I think that was less than 40 seconds. You have a little more time. Now, I wanted to ask you why, I of course agree with you on this positive emphasis. And I also really love and want to emphasize the sense that what we're doing has this, we are not particularists, we are universalists. I always want to get Charles to talk more about his past, because I don't know if people know that he was fighting in South Africa against apartheid, which, that's a lot of street credibility in our world. Meaning ISGAP is not just focused on, as Charles said, anti-Semitism, but on any kind of othering. But Charles, I want to ask you, why is it so hard for people to acknowledge, especially in America? And we're talking about these people who you refer to, who identify as white universalists. How come they can't see what's happening? Meaning, on the one hand, it's true, anti-Semitism is rampant, but one of the things that fascinates me is Jews in the academy. How do they tell themselves that things are still okay? I just don't get that. So either David or Charles, maybe Charles first, since it came from your talk. Yeah,
I'll go. It's a great question, David. Do you want to go ahead? I don't want to take all the time.
Well, Jews in the academy desperately want to be good Jews. And being good Jews in the academy often entails chiming in to the chorus of Israel bashing, demonizing, delegitimizing. Astoundingly, they want to be viewed as people, scholars of moral integrity. Like most of us want to be viewed that way. But being anti-Zionism has become morally required in the academy. You can't be considered a moral person if you support not the policies, but the existence of the Jewish state. And so in May of 2020, you have more than 400 so-called scholars in Jewish studies, almost all of whom were Jewish, signing a statement condemning Israel. This is over the so-called annexation business, never happened, but condemning Israel not for misguided policy, but as an apartheid state guilty of crimes against humanity. If they, it's a longing to be considered a good Jew, to have a seat at the intellectual table. I think. Charles, what do you think?
Charles, yeah.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what you're saying. And apropos of what you said and Bill's question, you know, I'm reminded of my South African experience. So the person who was one of my mentors who sent me to do my graduate studies at Oxford was one of the founders of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, and he was a refugee in the UK. And he brought in Stephen Biko into the Black consciousness movement. But Stephen Biko was one of his students. And Stephen Biko wrote kind of about Black identity and Black power in a way, and Black consciousness was the movement he started. And I would urge everybody to read Stephen Biko on the issues of Black consciousness, because of he wrote about the racial oppression, the colonization of the French and the Dutch and the Afrikaners in South Africa, and the creation of the apartheid state, and the Nazism of the apartheid state. Verwoerd and Smuts, they were friends of Hitler and the Nazis, and the complete subjugation of African people from their land, from their culture. And he tried to reinstill a pride, a consciousness of African culture as a way to deal with the real apartheid system in Southern Africa. And I think he didn't write much, but what he wrote, I think, was very important. And I think that this can inform us in the Jewish community in 2023 to learn to have Jewish consciousness and Jewish pride as we deal with the negativity in our society and the pressures and challenges, but also to learn and to become enriched by the wisdom that we have. So I think Jewish consciousness could be a way to dealing with the situation that we're confronted with now.
Charles, can I just ask you one more question about that? I mean, it's so interesting to me the way you talk about these two experiences in the same kind of way. And I'm really, and also I think it's so interesting the way I guess the energy of ISGAP is informed by this implicit optimism, even though whenever we get together, we talk about the most depressing things, right? So I'm wondering, how do you see the relationship between these parts of your life? Like, how did you get to ISGAP? How did you get from South Africa to ISGAP?
It's a good question. So I think as a Jewish kid growing up in Quebec and Montreal, where there was anti-Semitism, I think the Jews were the quintessential other. And there were a lot of Holocaust survivors in the Montreal Jewish community. I grew up with many. And I think it was a very special community. So I think there was a strong Jewish consciousness in the community of Montreal, of Quebec. And I think that formed me. Mordechai Richler, Ruth Weiss, Leonard Cohen, the Bells Rabbi Daniel Mond, who I studied with. A very vibrant, rich community. And I think it instilled a lot of pride. So yeah, you know, coming from the Holocaust, of being active in Soviet and Ethiopian Jewry, and seeing the injustice of South Africa. I went there as a Jew. I spoke about my Jewish identity and my love for Israel with the comrades. They didn't all agree with me, but they respected me. And there was a strong affinity in the African community to Israel. Nelson Mandela's favorite book in prison was The Revolt by Menachem Begin. But it's the liberal, radical, communist, liberal, white, British people in the anti-apartheid movement that I think sullied the relationship to a large extent with the Jewish community in Israel. But that's a long story. But I think I went very naturally as a Jew to fight the racism. And I'll just tell you, I flew from London, where I was studying, and I stopped in Amsterdam, and I met my comrade, professor mentor, who sent me to Oxford. He was in exile for 25 years, and we flew back to South Africa together. And I remember taking off from Amsterdam, and this was in the, it was one of my first, it was 1991. And in those days in the European Union, I'm sitting in Amsterdam, about to fly to South Africa, and they had announcements in Afrikaans and Dutch and German and then in English. And I was sitting there, I'm going to fight the old Nazi ideology. It was the Nazi ideology of white supremacy in South Africa. And I'm sitting on the plane as a young Jewish kid from the suburbs of Montreal, listening to German as I'm going to fight the remnants of a racist regime with its roots in Nazism. And I'm thinking, I shouldn't have been on that plane. Right. And yet we're still here and we're still standing. And I'll just say one more thing. Barry Cosman points out the Jews were decimated. We know this, exterminated. Barry wrote about 10 years ago that over 85% of the Jewish people today don't live in the communities of their grandparents and don't speak the same language as their grandparents. Profound dislocation, and yet it's incredible. We're healthier, we're better educated, we're stronger and more equipped than perhaps ever in our history. That's a bit of a miracle. Despite the displacement, we have a strong, democratic, vibrant Israel. The community is strong and healthy. And I think we have the resources to deal with the challenges that we face.
I think we should take questions from other people, but I will have one last question for David. I mean, you're the head of the Holocaust. You're the head of the Texas Holocaust Commission, or can you just tell us a little bit about what you do and what that is like in Texas? I mean,
yeah, I hold an endowed chair in the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I have been on the Texas Holocaust Commission. It's two separate roles, two separate responsibilities. I mean, and we, through this center, we offer, PhDs in Holocaust studies. We have a total of 5 endowed chairs in Holocaust studies. So we are a center for students. Students come here to study the Holocaust because we.
Just briefly, David, how did you get to Holocaust studies?
Well, I got to Holocaust studies by way of philosophy, comparative literature, and engaging questions concerning good and evil, God and humanity, meaning and meaninglessness. Then one day, 1978, I had a student put a copy of Night by Elie Wiesel in my hands. I read the first page and I've been studying ever since. Wow. So it goes to the fundamental question of who are we as human beings? What does it mean to be a human being? Where lies the sanctity of the other human being? The Jewish tradition has an ancient, profound, and beautiful teaching along those lines. This week's Torah portion includes the plague of darkness in Egypt. And it says it was a darkness in which no man could see the face of his brother. That's the Egyptian darkness.
Very nice.
And in my mind, just for me, Judaism, the teachings of Judaism that Charles just mentioned, profound, beautiful, that is what lights up the face of the other human being, enables us to behold the face of the other and say to the other human being, here I am for you, hineni, right?
Excellent. So Charles, do you want to take over and take questions from the audience?
Yeah, thank you. So, yes, there's a bunch of people waiting patiently. So I see Ian Cohen first and then Daniel Ben-Ami. And if everybody if you want to make a comment or question, please put your hand up, your electronic hand up so I can see. So Mr. Cohen, Ian.
I'm muted. I was muted, sorry. Hi, Ian, I just finished my master's in Jewish education from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And one thing I have to say, I've been on this email list for a while, is, and I don't know if it's because it's the middle of the day during a weekday, and it's great to see so many people, but I'd love to see more younger people that are interested in this. And it's a little sad and concerning to me when I come to some of these things, and I don't see anyone from Jewish studies departments or students, or and I've listening to what you're saying. I had repeated issues at Jewish Theological Seminary on this topic because there was a very leftist tendency, and I am a liberal LGBT Jewish person who's mostly Ashkenazi, but also part Iraqi Jew. And so I have both of those sides of my family and traditions, and my passion is Jewish history. And I think a lot of the issue today is a lack of literacy in understanding Jewish identity and what the difference is between an ethno-religion and a religion, and that we have a tribal identity. And the racialization of Jews goes back so much farther than Nazism anyway. I mean, I was just thinking about in Spain and the Inquisition and the blood purity law that they passed, that the Jesuits, it wasn't until after the Shoah that the Jesuits finally stopped. If you were someone who was Christian that had Jewish ancestry, before that, you weren't even allowed to become a priest, I don't think. Like, there was something inherent in our blood. I mean, that's, I'm sure it goes back even farther, but you also have Immanuel Kant, the famous, philosopher who called Jews, spoke of us as having Oriental Palestinian flesh, and that we were non-white. And this is something that was, all around in discourse around, the scientific pseudo study of race. And so I think that on one hand, in America, and we assimilated into whiteness here, or my grandparents did, or my great-grandparents, as a way, whether it's shedding ethnic features, if you have them, changing your name, giving up Jewish traditions, but not actually then now their grandchildren and great-grandchildren actually believe that being a Russian or Polish Jew means you were just like Russian or Polish people, instead of being a Jew whose family ended up in Eastern Europe, and what it means to be also, for Ashkenazim, that we're also a Levantine people. And that's why sometimes there's somebody, regardless of their skin, there's darker Ashkenazim and there's lighter Mizrahi Jews. I have both of those sides in my own family. And there's a weaponization and a politicization of race, where someone like the king of Jordan in the Hashemite kingdom could be a person of color, even though he's white with blue eyes. But somebody who, like Sacha Baron Cohen or Jeff Goldblum, could be a white European colonizer. And so I think that colorism is a very real thing. Anti-Blackness is a very real thing.
Can I interrupt you? Can you just ask a question to either Charles or David? Or do you want them to comment maybe on what you said, Charles?
Sure,
David?
feel free to comment. I've also had a lot of pushback by people when I get into these conversations, especially younger people who insist that they're white privileged people who happen to also be Jews.
Right.
So
right.
Professor Patterson, you want to respond, or?
Well, that's just to reiterate that where race theory is operative, you have what Alfred Rosenberg called not race, but Racialization, which is similar to the limpieza de sangre thinking, that Racialization is race soul. Rosenberg, the Nazi ideologue, said that race character, thought, and soul are synonyms. So not only are Jews white, but they're irremissible, irredeemable. They fall outside the fold of redemption. And I think a lot of what drives anti-Semitism in its various forms is a longing for redemption, purification, limpieza, right? Sangre. And the Jew is the contagion, whether it's the Black Death in the 14th century or COVID in our own time. So it's not, it's the color is tied to contagion here. You can't be white and not be part of the disease or the cancer that threatens us. You can't be, and you can't be redeemed. You can't change.
Are you talking about like liberation theology or something?
Let's give somebody else a chance to
No, go
ask.
ahead.
There are lots of hands up. Yeah.
And I'll just say, Ian, I appreciate your comments. You made a lot of comments. I appreciate them. The only thing I would just say to add is that we have to be very, I think, careful. One, I guess there's Jewish identity or Jewish identities. Number one. Number two, what's happening in the United States of America in general, and specifically to the Jewish community, I would argue is unique. And we have to be mindful that America is not the world. The American Jewish community is not every Jewish community. And I think identities in Canada are very different than the identities in the United States, Jewish identity, and different in Europe, different in the UK, different in France, certainly different in the Middle East. So we have to be careful that, you know, the United States is one country in a complicated Jewish world and a complicated world in and of itself. So just there. So Daniel, and then I see Estelle.
Yeah, I found it a really interesting and stimulating discussion, but I just wanted to ask a question about your typology, Charles. Maybe David wants to comment as well. So you said there are three forms of anti-Semitism: racist, religious, and anti-Semitism against Jews as a people.
Mm-hmm.
So I wondered how two phenomena fit into that. First of all, Islamism. And by that, just to be clear, I'm not talking about Islam. I mean, there's a discussion to be had about Islam as a religion, but that's not what I'm referring to here. I'm referring to Islamism as what's called a religio-political movement. So a relatively modern political movement, which has anti-Semitism as its core, you know, how that fits into your typology. And the other thing, which David referred to, obviously not in relation to the typology, but more generally, is identity politics. So, you know, the idea that Jews are hyper white, they represent white privilege. So in other words, identity politics. So an inherently anti-universalist worldview that says people have to be assigned to particular identities, and Jews have a privileged identity. Obviously, I'm not agreeing with that. I'm arguing against it. But how does that fit into your typology? I wasn't clear about that either.
Yeah. No, so, you know, I gave the history of anti-Semitism, I think, in about 33 seconds. So, you know, bear with me for that. It was very crude. And yeah, of course, I do a lot of work on political Islam, the radical left, the radical right. You know, there's white racist movements in the United States. There's Black nationalist racist movements also in the United States. There's a rise of extreme nationalism and populism in different parts of the world. So, yeah. So I think it's almost like an onion. I think the attack on Jewish people today comes from the extreme left, the extreme right, kind of racist and identity politics as well, political Islam. It's a hodgepodge.
But so if you have a typology, where do you slot Islamism into that typology?
So I think David could speak to this, but I would say, you know, political Islam is the Muslim Brotherhood emerges about 100 years ago. It takes European notions of anti-Semitism, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and even Nazism, fascism, and fuses it with a very narrow version of Islam. So I think, you know, political Islam is a reactionary social movement with its roots, I'd say, largely in Europe, as a reaction to European British colonialism as well. And then I think in this current age of neoliberalism, where the state is being weakened by neoliberals and political Islamists, which is interesting, it fills a vacuum. as states collapse in the Middle East and are weakened in developed countries. But I'll leave it there because we have 4 more minutes. So Estelle, thank you, Daniel. Sorry for being quick.
Sure.
Estelle, you're muted.
Okay, I'm not an academic. I live in Ottawa. And I don't know, some of you have Canadian roots. Anti-Semitic incidents have been going up. The graph goes like this in Canada. Maybe partly because there's more reporting, I don't know. But the Jews are the victims of more racially motivated or actions than any other people in Canada, and we are 0.9% of the population. And right now in Ottawa, there is a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism in the public schools. The community recently rallied to, they have the mantra is equality and diversity. And that's very strongly taught in Canada. But Jews are not considered part of their concept of diversity. And yet our kids are receiving much more bullying based on their Jewish identity or their labeling of being Jewish than any other group. And my children, like the States, my children who are in university, very casually say, well, you know, maybe I have to go to that university, but it's so anti-Semitic, you know, and it is anti-Semitic. The Hillel, the JSU Hillel, they don't have any public profile where anybody can contact them because of the fear of, you know, anti-Semitic incidences. And a lot of it is some of it is white, you know, the radical right. But very unfortunately, I think a lot of it in the schools anyhow is from children who are raised in Muslim households. We have many Muslims in Ottawa, and are told that Jews are basically bad people. And there were kids that I know who, some other kids built a swastika and brought them into the room to show it to them right here in Ottawa now. And so I know that as an academic, there are a lot of issues from the left and the so-called progressives, but there is a desire, or put it this way, a tendency to not consider attacks on Jews as being racism or as being anything that one should worry about.
Right.
No.
Okay, thank you, Estelle. So David or Bill, do you want to respond quickly? We're out of time.
Sorry, yeah.
So Bill and David, last words.
For me, the takeaway is that there is still optimism even after the Holocaust, and I think that is the miracle in a way, that we still believe.
Well said, David.
Well, I think that the most profound measure we can take in response to those who would, when I say we Jews, who would define us and would eliminate our own self-definition, is to as has been suggested, is to go deeper and learn more about our own teaching and tradition, the depth and the beauty of that teaching, the ways in which it transforms us into witnesses, to enable us to say to our fellow human being, not just to Jews, it's here I am for you. Just knowing who I am. You know, when Jacob wrestled with the angel at Peniel and asked the angel to bless him, the angel said to him, "What is your name?" We have to know our name. And to be asked is to be blessed. So I like what Charles said about Jewish pride. I like what Bill has commented on about the incredible, as I say, depth and beauty of Jewish teaching and tradition. There's nothing like it. Partly because it's a tradition that tells us we have to learn from the other nations, right? He is wise who can learn from anyone. So that's my closing thought.
Beautiful.
So thank you. And then just one final comment. I know there's a lot of hands up, but we really have to, we have a hard stop now. But I would just like to say for the scholars, on August the 6th, for 2 weeks, we have an intensive training program at Oxford University. It's a summer school. And I urge everybody to apply. You can write to Daphne if any of the scholars on the call are interested. You can write to Daphne Kleinman at ISGAP, and she will answer any queries about the Summer Institute. So it's Daphne, DAPHNE dot Kleinman, KLAJMAN at isgap.org. So stay well. Shabbat is coming. Have a good Shabbat. Thanks for taking the time to be with us, and we'll have more sessions in the near future. Be well, everybody, and commemorate well.
Thank you.